If you buy PC parts at Micro Center the way most people do, you're spending more money than you realize. Here's the part nobody tells you. Once you feel comfortable, once you feel like you're in the right place, you start saying yes to things you didn't plan to buy. Most people don't notice it because they leave feeling good. They got help. They saw the parts in person. They didn't get scammed. So they assume they did fine. But later, when they compare prices, they realize something uncomfortable. They spent more than they needed to, and they don't even know exactly where it happened. By the end of this video, you'll understand where the extra money disappears, why it keeps happening, and when buying from Micro Center actually makes sense and when it doesn't. This isn't about hating the store. It's about not quietly losing money every time you trust it. So don't buy PC parts at Micro Center again until you watch this. They don't love you. They love that you trust them. Here's something you probably haven't said out loud, but you've definitely felt it. Micro Center feels like it's for you. Not for casuals, not for impulse buyers, for people who actually know what RAM timings are, for people who build, upgrade, tweak, and obsess. That feeling matters, because the moment you believe a store is on your side, you stop treating it like a store. You stop thinking, what are they trying to sell me? And you start thinking, they wouldn't screw me. But here's the plain truth. Micro Center is not your friend. They're not a community center. They're not there to protect your wallet. They're a business that's extremely good at selling to people who think they're hard to sell to. And that's not an insult. That's the system. The staff is knowledgeable. The shelves are curated. The whole place is designed to make you feel like you're shopping somewhere smarter than everywhere else. And when you feel smarter, you drop your guard. You trust the recommendation faster. You skip the price check. You assume the option in front of you is reasonable. That trust is valuable, not to you, to them. Because once a store earns your trust, it doesn't have to fight you on every item. It only has to nudge you forward, one decision at a time, one that makes sense, moment after another. And the scary part? You'll walk out thinking you did great, not because you saved money, but because nothing felt wrong. And that's exactly why the next part works so well. Because once they've earned your trust, they only need one irresistible deal to pull you all the way in. The cheap CPU is the bait. Let's talk about the deal everyone brags about, the CPU. That absurdly cheap processor makes you feel like you just beat the system. You tell your friends about it, you see people online posting receipts like trophies, and you walk into Micro Center thinking, I'm already ahead before I even start. That feeling is not an accident. That CPU isn't there to save you money. It's there to get you inside the store. Micro Center is perfectly fine, making almost nothing on that one part, and sometimes even losing a little, because they know something most buyers don't fully think through. Once you've driven there, parked, and picked up that CPU, you're no longer shopping casually. You're committed. At that point, the trip has momentum. Here's how it usually plays out. You come in for the CPU, grab it, and then reality kicks in. Someone points out that you'll need a motherboard for that chip, which is reasonable. But now the comparison changes. You're no longer comparing every motherboard on the internet. You're comparing what's available on the shelf in front of you. You're already there, time matters, and walking out empty-handed to do more research feels inefficient. So you make a choice. Not a reckless one, and not a bad one on paper. Just a slightly better motherboard than you planned, a few more features for future-proofing, and a little more money that feels justified in the moment. Then it happens again. Someone asks if you already have compatible RAM. Someone asks about your cooler. Someone mentions that most people pair this CPU with a certain model. None of it sounds pushy, and none of it feels wrong. It sounds helpful. That's the trap. Each decision feels small when it happens, and each one feels logical on its own. The problem isn't any single choice. It's how quickly they stack up once you're already moving forward. You didn't come in planning to buy half a build, and you didn't plan to spend that much money, but momentum doesn't care what you planned. By the time you reach the register, you're no longer buying a CPU. You're finishing a build you didn't fully intend to start that day. When you walk out, you feel good about it. You didn't get scammed, you didn't feel pressured, and you handled everything in one trip. That feels efficient, adult, and smart. Later, when the excitement wears off, something starts to bother you. You realize you saved money on the CPU, but you spent more than expected on everything around it. Not because the prices were outrageous, but because you stopped slowing down long enough to question them. That's the real function of the cheap CPU. It's not the deal, it's the bait. And if you think that's clever, the next part is even more dangerous, because it makes the upsell feel like your idea, not theirs. They make the upsell feel like your idea. This is where Micro Center really separates itself from other stores. They don't pressure you and they don't rush you. Nobody stands there telling you that you have to buy something. Instead, they guide the conversation just enough that you start upgrading on your own. You'll hear phrases like, "Most people go with this one," or "For a little more, you get much better features," or "Since you're already building now, this just makes more sense." None of that sounds aggressive. It sounds like advice from someone who knows what they're talking about. And that's intentional, because once you believe the choice came from you, you stop questioning it. The CPU and motherboard bundle is the clearest example. On the surface, it looks like a reward for being informed. Buy the right CPU, pair it with the right board, and you save a little extra. It feels efficient. It feels smart. It feels like you cracked a code other shoppers don't even see. But something subtle happens in that moment. You stop asking, "Is this the best board for what I actually do?" And you start asking, "Which one of these feels like the best upgrade?" That shift matters more than most people realize. The options you're shown aren't random, they're curated. Usually it's a small range, carefully spaced in price, that gently pushes you upward. Each step costs just a little more, and each step comes with a justification that sounds reasonable. Maybe it's better power delivery, maybe it's extra connectivity, maybe it's future-proofing. None of those reasons are wrong on their own. The problem is that they quietly move you away from what you needed and toward what feels safer to buy. And here's the part most people miss. Nobody ever says, "You're upgrading." You say it to yourself. You tell yourself you're being careful. You tell yourself you're avoiding regret. You tell yourself that spending a little more now is smarter than wishing you had later. The upsell doesn't feel like a sales move. It feels like good judgment. But when the build is done and the excitement fades, the math looks different. You realize you paid extra for features you don't use. You bought headroom you never touch. You spent more money to eliminate fears that were never likely to become real problems. That's not a coincidence. That's what happens when a store designs its sales flow so that the higher-priced option feels like a personal decision instead of a recommendation. And if you think this only happens with motherboards, the next part is even more uncomfortable because it involves the one thing you trust more than any shelf label or bundle deal. The person helping you, the guy. Helping you isn't your friend. This is the part that makes people uncomfortable because it feels personal. You're not dealing with a website anymore. You're talking to a real person. Someone standing right in front of you who actually knows the difference between CL16 and CL18, who can explain why one chipset is better than another, and who doesn't need to look anything up. That alone lowers your guard. Because when someone sounds competent, you assume they're neutral. You assume they're just there to help you avoid mistakes. You assume their goal is the same as yours, to build something solid without wasting money. But here's the line you have to keep clear in your head. They're not your friend, they're not your build partner. They work for the store. That doesn't make them dishonest, and it doesn't make them bad people. Most of them genuinely like PCs and want you to leave happy. But it does mean their incentives are not the same as yours. The employee helping you is trained to keep the sale moving forward, not to slow things down, not to send you home to think about it, not to say, honestly, you don't need that. And you can hear it in how the conversation unfolds. You ask a simple question like whether a certain part is good enough, and suddenly you're hearing about a better option that's only a little more. You mention you want something reliable, and reliability quietly gets translated into a higher priced tier. Nothing feels pushy. Nothing feels aggressive. It feels like guidance, but guidance always has a direction. Once that direction is set, it becomes surprisingly hard to reverse. Saying, "Actually, I'll go with the cheaper one," starts to feel awkward. You don't want to seem uninformed. You don't want to feel like you're wasting their time. So you go along with it. You trust the human more than the price tag. You trust the conversation more than the research you did at home. And because the advice sounds reasonable, you don't question it in the moment. You question it later, after the build is done, after the receipt is printed, after you've had time to think. That's when you realize that compatible slowly turned into premium, and good enough quietly turned into why not. Not because you needed those upgrades, but because agreeing felt easier than stopping the momentum and pushing back. And if this is already making you uncomfortable, that's a good thing. Because this video is about noticing the stuff most people miss. So if this is hitting close to home, take 1 second and hit like and subscribe if you want more breakdowns like this. It helps the video reach people who are about to make the same mistakes. And it tells me you want more content that saves you money instead of selling to you. Now here's the important part. This effect gets even stronger in one specific area of the store, where logic almost completely disappears and emotion takes over. And once you see that section, you'll never shop there the same way again. Seeing the GPU in person messes with your head. This is where logic really starts to slip. GPUs aren't just another component. They're the heart of the build, the most expensive single part. And for the last few years, they've been tied to stress, shortages, scalpers, and constant frustration. So when you see a GPU sitting on a shelf, physically in front of you, something happens almost instantly. You feel relief. No waiting for shipping updates, no refreshing stock alerts, and no wondering if the box will arrive damaged or not arrive at all. It feels safe, it feels final, it feels like progress. That feeling is far more powerful than most people realize. Even though the shortage era is mostly over, your brain hasn't caught up yet. It still treats GPUs as scarce, so availability alone starts to feel like value, even when the price itself hasn't been carefully considered. Standing in the store, you're not thinking about price history or upcoming sales. You're not checking whether this exact model was cheaper last week or might drop next month. You're thinking about how good it feels to finally move forward without friction. Micro Center understands that psychology perfectly. The GPUs are displayed like trophies. They're behind glass, cleanly stacked and well lit. The entire presentation turns a piece of hardware into something emotional instead of analytical. Then, a small comment lands. These are moving pretty fast. We've only got a few left of this one. People have been coming in just for these. Even when those statements are technically true, they carry more weight than they should. They tap directly into old fear. Fear of missing out, fear of going home empty-handed, and fear of repeating a bad experience you already lived through once. So your internal math changes. You stop asking, is this the best price? And start asking, do I really want to risk not getting one? At that point, timing replaces strategy. Paying a little more feels reasonable if it means certainty. You tell yourself the difference isn't that big. You frame it as paying for convenience, peace of mind, or avoiding hassle. What you're really buying is emotional relief, and emotional relief is expensive. Later, when you're no longer standing in the store, that relief fades. You see a sale pop up online, you notice a price drop a few weeks later, and you realize you could have waited without any real downside. You weren't ripped off, and you weren't lied to. But you didn't win either. You paid extra because availability short-circuited patience. That's the trick. Seeing the GPU in person makes you feel in control, when in reality, it bypasses the part of your brain that normally slows down, compares, and waits. Availability feels like an advantage. It isn't. And if GPUs can push you into spending more this easily, the next section is where it gets even quieter, because the real money doesn't disappear on big parts. It disappears on the small ones you barely think about at all. This is where they actually make their money. This is the part almost nobody pays attention to. Not the CPU, not the GPU, the small stuff. By the time you reach this point, your build already feels decided. The big money has been spent, the hard choices are over, and that's exactly when your defenses are the lowest. Because now, everything feels cheap by comparison. A $20 cable doesn't feel like anything when you're already spending over $1,000. A $30 fan barely registers. Thermal paste, adapters, RGB controllers, Wi-Fi cards, all of it feels minor and almost forgettable. But this is where the receipt quietly starts to grow. Micro Center knows that once the core build is locked in, most people stop price checking entirely. You're not pulling out your phone to compare the cost of a DisplayPort cable. You're not researching whether that fan is $10 cheaper online. You're just trying to finish. And finishing feels good, so you grab what's right there. The cable that's guaranteed to work. The fan that matches the rest. The accessory that saves you another trip. Each choice feels harmless because it's small. But small adds up fast. 2 fans turn into 4. 1 cable turns into 3. That might as well pile grows without you noticing. This is also where convenience quietly replaces discipline. You tell yourself it's not worth the hassle to save a few dollars here and there. You convince yourself your time is more valuable, and in isolation, that logic makes sense. The problem is that this logic repeats over and over. By the time you're done, those small items have added a surprising amount to your total. Not because any single price was outrageous, but because you stopped treating them like decisions. They weren't purchases anymore, they were afterthoughts. And that's the point. Big ticket items get all the attention, but accessories are where margins are fat and resistance is low. You don't argue, you don't hesitate, and you just add them to the pile. Later, when you look at the receipt, you might notice it, you might not. Most people don't. They just know the build somehow cost more than expected. Even though nothing felt expensive in the moment, that's where the money actually goes. And if you think that's bad, the next section is even more effective because it doesn't rely on convenience at all. It relies on fear. They sell you fear, not protection. This is where the tone changes. Up until now, everything has felt optional, convenient, and easy to justify. But right at the end, when you're almost done, they introduce something much heavier, fear. It usually happens near the register, or right after you've locked in the most expensive parts. Someone asks a simple question that doesn't sound like a sales pitch at all. Do you want protection on that? Have you thought about a warranty? Just in case something goes wrong. Instantly, your brain jumps ahead to worst-case scenarios. You think about dead-on-arrival parts, RMA nightmares, and weeks without your PC. You start imagining the most painful outcome, not because it's likely, but because it would be frustrating if it happened. That's the moment they're selling to. Extended warranties and protection plans aren't really about protection. They're about relieving anxiety at the exact moment you're most vulnerable to it. You've already spent a lot of money, you're emotionally invested, and the idea of something going wrong feels unacceptable. So paying extra feels reasonable. You tell yourself it's insurance. You tell yourself you're being responsible. You tell yourself it's better to be safe than sorry. What rarely gets explained clearly is how PC parts actually fail. Most components either fail very early or last for years, and manufacturers already cover that early failure window. The odds of your specific part dying in, the narrow gap where an extended warranty actually matters, are much lower than your fear makes them feel. That doesn't mean protection plans are always useless. There are edge cases where they make sense, but those cases are rare, and they're almost never framed that way in the moment. Instead, the choice is presented emotionally. You hear things like, "You've already spent this much, it's not that much more," and "it'll give you peace of mind." Peace of mind is expensive when you're tired. By the time you're asked, you've already made dozens of decisions. Your mental energy is low, and you just want to be done. Saying yes feels easier than stopping to do probability math in your head, so you add it. Later, when nothing goes wrong, and most of the time nothing does, you don't feel relieved. You forget about it entirely. The money is gone, and the fear that justified it never materialized. That's how fear-based selling works. Not by lying to you, but by making unlikely problems feel urgent and personal at the worst possible time. And if you think that's the last psychological trick, it isn't. The final one doesn't rely on fear or trust at all. It relies on something even harder to resist. Convenience is the most expensive feature. By the time you reach this point, you're tired. Not physically tired, but decision tired. You've compared CPUs, picked a GPU, and answered questions about RAM, cooling, storage, and compatibility. You've made dozens of small choices, and each one felt important in the moment. Now you just want to be done. This is where convenience quietly takes over. Micro Center is built to feel like the solution to that exhaustion. Everything is in one place. Everything works together, and everything can be finished today. There's no waiting, no second trips, and no more tabs open on your phone. That feels incredible. So you start valuing speed over savings. You tell yourself it's not worth ordering one more part online to save a few dollars. You tell yourself your time is worth more than the difference. You tell yourself that finishing the build today is the real win. Individually, those thoughts make sense. The problem is how often they repeat. Each time you choose convenience, you give up a little leverage. You stop asking whether something is the best option and start asking whether it's good enough to move on. You stop optimizing and start settling. Not because you don't care, but because you're mentally done. That's when one-stop shopping becomes expensive. Convenience doesn't show up as a single charge. It shows up as a pattern. A few extra dollars here, a slightly higher price there, and a part you could have gotten cheaper elsewhere, but didn't want to wait for. None of it feels dramatic. It just quietly inflates the total. The most dangerous part is that convenience feels like a personal choice, not a trade-off. You don't feel pressured, you feel efficient, you feel decisive, you feel like an adult who knows when to stop obsessing. But every time you choose convenience, you're paying for it. Not with one big mistake, but with a dozen small ones that never felt like mistakes at all. That's why so many people walk out thinking they did fine. Even though the build cost more than it should have. They didn't get tricked, they got tired. Once you understand that, the final question becomes obvious. If all of this is true, when should you actually buy from Micro Center? And when should you walk away? That's next. When buying from Micro Center is actually smart. After everything you've seen so far, it would be easy to say, so just never shop at Micro Center. That would be simple, dramatic, and completely wrong. Because Micro Center does make sense sometimes. You just have to use it deliberately instead of emotionally. Let's start with the most obvious case, CPUs. This is where Micro Center genuinely shines. Their CPU pricing is often excellent, especially when you factor in instant availability and occasional bundle discounts. If you already know exactly which CPU you want, and you're disciplined enough to walk in, buy it, and leave, this can be one of the smartest purchases you make. The key is not letting that one good deal pull you into everything else. Micro Center also makes sense when something breaks, and you need a fix immediately. A dead motherboard, a failing power supply, or bad RAM can take your entire system offline. And waiting days for shipping isn't always realistic. In those moments, paying a little more to get your system back online today can be worth it. That's not wasting money. That's solving a real problem. Open box deals are another place where experienced buyers can win. If you know how to inspect parts, understand return policies, and aren't afraid to walk away, there are real discounts hiding there. These aren't impulse buys. They reward patience and knowledge. Micro Center can also be useful for learning and troubleshooting. Being able to physically see parts, ask specific technical questions, and sanity check compatibility can save you from much bigger and more expensive mistakes later. But notice the pattern in all of this. Micro Center works best when you already know what you want, you already know the price, and you already know when to say no. It stops working the moment you walk in, hoping the store will figure things out for you. Because once you hand over that control, the system takes over. Momentum builds, convenience creeps in, small decisions stack up. Before you realize it, you've spent more than you planned, not because you were careless, but because the environment is designed to make that feel normal. So here's the final reframe. Micro Center isn't a villain, it isn't a scam, and it isn't your friend. It's a machine that rewards informed, disciplined buyers and quietly taxes emotional, tired ones. You don't wander into it, you don't browse it, you use it. You walk in with a short list, a clear budget, and the willingness to leave if the math stops making sense. You buy the part that actually makes sense there, and you buy the rest on your own terms, because the store didn't change. The prices didn't suddenly get worse. The only thing that changes whether you win or lose is whether you shop on autopilot or with intention. So the next time you think about buying PC parts at Micro Center, remember this. You're not saving money just because it feels convenient. You're not making a smart choice just because it feels comfortable. And the moment you stop paying attention is the moment you start spending more than you should. If this video helped you see the store differently, let me know in the comments. Tell me what part you overpaid for, or the one time Micro Center actually saved you. And if you want more breakdowns like this, subscribe so you don't walk into the next purchase blind, because you don't need to stop shopping there. You just need to stop letting the store think for you.